Good morning, BookTube. This is ML Clark coming to you with Better Worlds Theory YouTube edition. I am joined, as always, by my special guest, The Highway. It is Saturday, too, so it might be a little bit more boisterous than usual. We shall see. But in the last few weeks, I've been discussing a lot of the fiction in my genre. We've been talking about speculative fiction magazines. We've been talking about books as well. And the conversations that emerge from all of this literature are only possible because of the curation that goes into them, something that I talk about when I talk about the magazines too. Here today, I'd like to foreground some of that work. The curatorial side of things is different in magazines and in publishing in general. The editing that goes into curation, it's one part of curation. There's also selection and curation. There's organizing a structure, but the editing of individual works is a challenge, an important challenge, and it's also something that in our era we have seen scatter and diversify in some complicated ways. It used to be that for many publishers there was a strong relationship between the editor and the author. Time would be taken wrestling with getting a manuscript into the form necessary for publication. But right now, because we have an absolute surfeit of manuscripts and eager authors, publishers do not need to invest in those relationships. They can expect a higher quality of work right from the outset. And so what happens is that writers are lacking a level of mentorship and growth over the course of their careers that perhaps was more present in certain aspects of past publishing contexts, to the detriment of everyone, obviously. Editing relationships are wonderful. They create tension. They create motivation. They challenge the writer to think carefully about the choices they're making. Not to say that writers don't do that anyway, but to have another voice asking questions that we might not have asked ourselves is very important. Sometimes we can get hung up in certain parts of the process and we will miss others. It's having somebody else that we trust to help us in that journey, to explore our writing and to refine our writing with us is a real privilege. And it's one that's not necessarily available to many people now. Many agents now fill this role, and that can be a problem too, because sometimes the agents will then try to push their own sense of what will sell onto a piece, and that might not be to the benefit of the author as well. But the agent also needs to get paid, so there is reason for that kind of shift. So a lot of people then also turn to freelance editors or editors outside of the process, outside of the publishers, outside of their agent relationships. And that's where a different kind of exploitation or tension can emerge. I am an editor for many folks in many ways. I have volunteer editing roles that I am proud of. They're not supposed to be about fame and fortune. They are about being present with my community, giving back to my community, and hopefully helping a lot of novice voices learn to be more confident and to understand better what is expected in a professional context in our industry. I've been very thankful to see a lot of writers go on to write other work elsewhere after with more confidence than they had coming in to my cues, which is great. I also do freelance editing in a paid capacity, and the funny thing is that I know a lot of people will push and say, oh yeah, I'm a freelance editor, hire me. I'm always extremely cautious actually about this side. I like to warn people about this side, and that's because I'm a writer too. I know full well that the money should flow toward the writer. So, as an editor, I want to make sure I'm providing value and I am setting responsible expectations, because unfortunately, some people so desperately want to publish that they will pay. They will pay for advertising, they will pay for great cover art, they will pay for freelance editing of their work with strong confidence that there will be returns on that investment. And yet, it's not always true. that you're going to even break even, it is in fact very difficult to expect that a self-published work is going to make you any real money. You have to commit to it as a lifestyle, essentially, consistently publishing, consistently working your brand in that way to get anywhere. And that's fine. That is a way of working in an industry with very few options, but it is dangerous because you will have people promising you the world. So you have to be careful. So as a freelance editor, it's kind of funny. I discourage people from using my services. I have a roster and I help where I can, but I want people to know full well that there's no magical editor out there, unless the editor is actually aligned with a major publisher, who's going to suddenly skyrocket your career. What really makes the difference for work is simply level of investment in promotion. And that's what a major publisher offers. Editing will certainly help. It will help you learn more about yourself as a writer. It will help you grow, especially in that wonderful, really chewy mid-career phase when you've maybe had one or two breakout successes, you've become well known for being published in a magazine or two, and now you need to continue to develop as a writer, and yet there are no structures in place for it. You have to figure out, do workshops, creative writing groups, or again, editorial relationships to help you get to the next point. So after this last week, in which I've actually had a few different interactions just this last week as an editor across many different roles, so the freelance side and the volunteer side and the also general amicable side with friends whose work I read and offer thoughts on. Many of the problems that we face as writers come down to one key concept. Are you demonstrating an awareness of your audience and a trust in your audience? A lot of people think, well, of course I trust my audience. They're reading my work, so I'm putting my vulnerable thoughts and feelings and my great world into their hands. Of course I trust them. But what one often sees in the writing is the author trying to tell the story first to themselves and not yet getting to the point where they're ready to tell it to anybody else. And so they're explaining the rules of the world to themselves more than anything. And then when they get to the part where they have to start writing for somebody else, they often come off, without meaning to, as a little bit condescending and distrustful, simply because they're spelling out things that should be obvious if they can trust the readership to be able to follow along, use some common sense, enjoy the world. This is an anxiety more than anything. There's a lot of emotion that goes into writing. We want so much to get our thoughts across and be understood perfectly. One of the biggest challenges that writers have, and which editors are around to help push back on, is that anxiety about not being understood, moving the writer to an acceptance that yes, you won't be understood 100% of the time or in the ways that you want to be. We writers, for some reason, choose to spend our lives trying to communicate with others on a level that is polished and formal and artificial in some ways. Most of us, like right now, communicate directly, one take, for better or for worse, with one another. And so communication is just part of being human. But something about the activity of writing, of getting words down, gives us to feel as though if we can only get the words in just the right polished order, then everyone will understand. Then it will be perfect. Then there will be no mistakes. And it's a beautiful fake, but it leads us to a lot of problems. An editorial relationship will help to refine what you want to say. It will also help you come to accept immediately, intimately, that not everyone is going to fully understand everything that you're trying to say. You can get close sometimes. You can have these beautiful turns of phrase, really powerful, and they'll be moving, but you will still have readers who take something else from it. You cannot shape your writing around the expectation or even the hope that every single reader is going to be able to get exactly the intent that you were trying to lay out. If you fixate too much on trying to make sure that you are perfectly, precisely understood, what you will usually end up doing is insulting the intelligence of pretty much every other reader in the process. What this often looks like is people giving too many background details that don't make sense within the world itself. Imagine two characters are wandering off for a little bit and are having a conversation with each other. For them, this is just a regular day interaction in their world. It's the water in which they swim. There's no need for them necessarily, outside of a few extenuating circumstances, to be talking more about every facet of the background that shapes their universe, their sociopolitics, their economics, their religious structures. Some of it will come up because we do, as humans, argue about some of these things, but one has to ask, are they talking to each other, or is the author just using these two props to try to create a back and forth that will give key information to the reader? So the way that one moves past that anxiety, which usually manifests in those early drafts, those first drafts, in the form of stilted conversation or heavy-handed detail, far more detail to really emphasize every connection, every background detail, is to then ask yourself, if you were in that scene, if you were in that moment, how much of this would be useful to your everyday life? How much of this would be useful to how you're moving through the world? Would you have these conversations? Would you need to check with yourself all of the, essentially, the physics engine of your universe before you go forward? Do I have to check the physics engine of my universe before I go to make myself a coffee in the morning? Do I need to think about every facet of bean construction, how we create the industry of all the material elements and the energy elements necessary? No. But there are details that can be quite useful for creating context. So for instance, for example, I do happen to be in a culture that's still much more leaning towards gas stoves, even though many parts of the world have shifted away from that. So a little detail can emerge normally, and the problem is simply teaching the writer to let those little details be enough, to allow the reader to fill in the blanks and to draw the conclusions that they will. There is that anxiety, but what if they draw the wrong conclusions? What if they think that because I have the gas stove, I'm actually making a comment about, a certain group of folks in the U.S. right now who are tying gas stoves into a political discourse, when really I'm just making coffee for myself in Colombia, another country completely. You cannot control all those details. But the whole question of purpose when we're writing needs to be resolved for ourselves before we can comfortably put down the worlds that we want to on the page. We have to embrace that once we finish our side of the conversation, once we have words on the page and they're published, they are out of our hands. They are going to be read in the context in which they are found by each reader. Each reader is going to bring their own world, their own interpretations, their own political discourse, their own affective relationship to certain elements to those pages. One of the biggest problems I face or see on the page in many of my editing roles is this question of how much the writer is willing to allow that there will be variation in interpretation and understanding. Once they get past that, once they are no longer worried about establishing their own authority claim, hashing out every detail of the world, trying to tell the story of the world to themselves, even if it means using characters as props, then we get to the magic, the real pleasure of literature. And by literature, I don't just mean fiction. It can also be nonfiction as well. Because once you know which details are actually important, which ones are of use to the characters in your scene, of most essential importance to the argument that you are trying to advance, you create a priority chain with your work that will absolutely help the right readers find it. You're never going to be speaking well to everyone. Your work is always going to be boring to some. It might even be offensive or annoying to others. But getting past that first component, that anxiety, the info dumping, that's not just about info dumping, that's about trying to tell the story of the world to yourself, that's trying to hash out every detail so there can't possibly be miscommunication. Once you've passed that hurdle, then I think it's safe to say that you as a writer are finally at a point with that story, and I say with that story because you might lose it again and have to find it again with your next story, of being able to share something a little bit deeper. The question of your priorities, what matters to you, what you find interesting. And the audience will emerge from that. So how you show that you know your audience, first and foremost, is knowing what publication you're submitting to, what genre you're writing within, and then thinking about the kind of background experiences that audience will have. But also thinking about trust. It comes from not expecting that everyone is going to follow along, trusting only that the right readers will follow the trail that you've laid out if it's not completely overwhelmed by all of these extraneous other factors. In practice, this means you will go through some bad drafts. You will go through some writing that is long-winded and murky and confusing, and your characters will sound wrong, and you will maybe try too hard to lean onto other authorities. Sometimes a lot of nonfiction writers do this. They'll throw down tons of names of famous people just because they think having that name in the work will suddenly make the work seem strong. They're hiding behind those names because they're not yet confident, they don't trust themselves, and so they can't trust their audience. Get past all of that. Get past those phases. And it's not just that your writing will improve, but your whole pragmatic relationship to the industry, to the art, will change as well. So it's not just that it will make you a better quote-unquote writer, to be more cognizant of the ways in which you might be overtelling your world and insulting your audience in the process. It's also that the confidence you gain from writing in a more refined manner, without all of the details, without all of the explanations, suggests or indicates that you yourself have a more grounded understanding of what is possible, what is feasible, what is realistic within the work that you're doing as a writer. And hopefully that will help you with many other anxieties along the way. Publishing is tough. You're never going to find a home in every publication because your work isn't for every audience. So know thyself as ever. And when you are able to do that, hopefully you will see a tremendous benefit across the board. To do that, you do need to have the right allies, and that also means knowing that there are the wrong allies. So be very careful and judicious in your choice of editing relationship. Pay attention when you're looking for a good editor of your work, for somebody who demonstrates an awareness of what you are striving toward. It doesn't mean that they will understand everything, but do they understand enough? Can you see in their comments, in their read, that they see what you are trying to create? And also ask yourself, hopefully with a test run, it would be nice if you can do that, if their attempts to revise the work are really about aligning discordant elements within the context to better uphold and uplift your voice, or Are they just trying to write the story the way that they would write it? This becomes easier, especially in terms of discernment, once you know the story that you are trying to tell and you are comfortable not trying to tell all the stories at once. So you will also probably have a few missteps with editors along the way. Hopefully they will not be too costly. That's why a lot of people are encouraged to focus on workshops and smaller communities before taking a deep dive, because freelance editing is expensive. And again, you cannot go into it expecting that it's going to yield a phenomenal output. You're not going to shoot up to the bestsellers list, unfortunately, with your self-published work. If you are fortunate enough to have a solid agent and a good publisher, amazing. But just having an agent or just having a publisher does not intrinsically mean that you have the best editing relationship, especially because of how strategic and streamlined the industry has had to be. So these are some thoughts for the day. It's just been a wild week where I've seen a lot of different circumstances in fiction and nonfiction alike, where definitely that conversation with oneself, which takes place on the page in our first drafts, has not yet progressed to something that really shows trust in the readership, and sometimes can feel like it's insulting the readership. See it as a process. See not just the writing as the process, but the pursuit of good collaborative partners for the writing as a process. And remember, if you can, that even though text can create this illusion of more refined connection, the hard reality is that there is no magic text or magic arrangement of words that will reach everybody in exactly the same way. That's just part of the condition of being human. But if you can write in a way that feels true to your own priorities, you will find that some people will follow that trail of breadcrumbs and will enjoy your work, even if maybe they are reading it still, ultimately, to their own ends and in their own ways. So that's that for this week. Next week we will be getting back to Clark's World, I think, yes. And we'll go forward and do some more magazine reviews and book reviews, but always keep in mind the curatorial relationship that makes them possible and the tremendous amount of editing labor that goes into them too. Thanks for your time today. Have a really good one, and good luck, good writing, and good editing to you all.